Hmm. Okay, so I suggest that we start from this question. Like,
Sure.
why are you interested in philosophy? Can you tell me your story? Like, how did you start studying it, and what was the reason?
My background is architecture, so I'm an architect. I got into philosophy at a pretty early age, just kind of studying in a school. We were reading some of the dialogues of Plato, and that got me kind of interested in philosophy. But as an architect, we do deal a lot with philosophy, dealing with things like aesthetics and things, but in primary and also where it relates to architecture, but have a general interest in knowledge, particularly with culture, things like that. And I think philosophy, understanding kind of how the I don't want to say how the human mind works, but how humans, so we try to understand and view the world and understand knowledge is an important thing. And that's what primarily got me interested in philosophy.
So it was your early age when you studied at university, right?
This would have been in high school for Americans, so
High
not
school.
before university, yeah,
Mhm.
pre-university.
But you said architecture, but did you study later? Like you mentioned Plato, like you were reading Plato in high school,
Yes, yes,
and like you say some kind of aesthetics, right? So it's like the beauty and all these principles. Like were they described in Plato? Maybe you can remember some dialogue or.
yes. I mean, obviously, in the parable of the cave, clearly looking at
Mhm.
the idea of aesthetics and idealized forms and how things take lesser degree of that idealization. That's certainly something that comes from Plato. And some of this, again, how it ties to architecture is a little bit more tenuous, but understanding the concepts of what partakes of beauty and things like that certainly is a Platonic ideal.
Mhm. Do you have your own thoughts on beauty? Like what actually what is beauty, right? What constitutes beauty?
I Beauty is definitely it's not an easy question. Certainly, beauty is incredibly subjective view, and one that's kind of interesting in terms of architecture is how beauty has changed.
Mhm.
But in terms of what we look at, going into Plato and the idea that beauty is tied up with certain idealized forms, with ideas of symmetry, with ideas of rational proportions, so things like the golden mean
Mhm.
and things like that. So those are all very kind of Platonic ideas. In fact, they predate Plato. And Plato certainly included them in it. And those are kind of some of our ideas as we've um, kind of developed more with art and our different views of especially kind of the modernist movement, where you start getting some ideas about rejecting the ideas of symmetry,
Yeah, like
necessary as beauty. So if you look,
like Van Gogh, for
right, look,
example, right? There's no symmetry, but there's some kind of some pictures which are like uh against this idea. Like they represent something different, and it's still beautiful, we may say, right? When we look at something like this postmodernists, which you mentioned, like maybe some other artists.
right, yes. In terms of modernism, you get these ideas that we're going to become ahistorical in our sense and look at other concepts. There's concepts of motion. How do we depict motion, or even looking at imbalance? How do we think about that? So the concept of beauty is definitely one that's very subjective. But I think if we talk about like how the beauty of the human form relates, that's again tied off into this idea of symmetry. And it's one thing that's kind of interesting in architecture. We talk about philosophy and how philosophy is related to architecture. Is many of these writers like Vitruvius and Palladio, who are more probably widely known in architecture circles than they are in philosophical circles, talked about these ideas of relating these Platonic concepts to the idea of buildings, and particularly looking at the idea of how you translate how the human form relates to a building in many ways. And so those same concepts of symmetry and proportion all tie into the idea of architecture. But it goes even further than that, than architecture. If you look at many of the quote main classical arts, if you talk about music, it's very much the idea of proportions and harmonies are all related to proportional, rational presentations of like frequencies and things like that. So,
but there's so many different varieties of again proportion frequencies in music, and you say it's all subjective, but is there any like, I wouldn't call it objective, but some kind of similarities between certain patterns that we all enjoy, that we all like to see? The proportion, yeah, sure, but what kind of proportion, right? So is it perfectness, like it's perfect circle, a perfect triangle, a perfect, square, or is it not necessarily perfect? Is it something else?
it's yes. There's this idea, and again, going back to Plato, of perfection, in that we cannot actually we cannot reach perfection, yet it's the attempt to reach perfection. And so there's idealized forms that we try to understand them as humans. We believe they exist, and to whatever greater or lesser extent that something takes on aspects of those idealized forms, we tend to read that as being more beautiful, more appealing. So the idea of idealized like human beauty would be, to a certain extent, again, a symmetrical face to certain proportions. And there's been plenty of studies and plenty of talk about certain relationships like 2 to 3, 3 to 5, things like that are these kind of golden means that relate.
Yeah, and still
so
they're changing. They're changing throughout history, right? And like 500 years ago, there was beauty standards of beauty were different from what we have right now. Now it's like thinness and all this skinny, and before it was pale girls were kind of more like beautiful according to general standards. And perhaps like in the future it will be something else, like small, like short people, tall people. It's very hard to say that there's some common standards that is going to be
certainly. Yes, and that's definitely hard to say. I mean, what are common standards? I mean, if we talk about, again, these proportions, like in music, and I don't know if you're a musician or not, but we talk about the 1, 3, 5, that is in a scale, on a major scale. It's based on a proportion of frequencies of, we start in our main key note, and then we go to 3 and go to 5, and that tends to be, for most human ears, tends to be regarded as very pleasing, as a very pleasing major scale. And the same thing works kind of in architecture, where there's a 1 to 3 to 5 proportion, a lot, or forms. Now, again, a lot of people challenge that idea. And so what is considered beauty or what is considered art? Some people deliberately say, well, we'll challenge the idea of proportionality and come up with something different. Maybe we go 1, 2, 4, 1, or something else, or 1, 7, and then you get, this is, and again, this is the hard part, is whether we're going to talk about there's a kind of universality of art and beauty. And it's again tied up. There's cultural associations, there's emotional associations, and there is, I think, a certain sense we don't consider just anything that way, but I think there are, to some extent, just the way humans work and just the way our minds wire, there are certain relationships that in general people find more pleasing, I guess might be the term, than necessarily beautiful. But because we talk about, again, with ideas of art, is that maybe we want to challenge the idea of pleasing. Maybe just being pleasing isn't enough. Maybe we want something that's more provokes a different kind of reaction. So.
Different type of emotions, right? Do you think it's multicultural, or in different cultures there are different standards for beauty? For example, something that American will consider beautiful, somebody like in Asia will say it's not beautiful. It's exactly the opposite. It's ugliness.
There certainly are. I mean, it's interesting. I think as we've gotten culture has gotten more globalized, it's gotten less, but you can certainly say there's certainly standards of certainly music, particularly like food, or something what is more pleasing certainly changes. I'm sure as a Russian, you probably enjoy foods that most Americans don't eat. And I'm sure there's plenty of foods people in Asia don't eat and quite enjoy that most Americans don't. But in terms of beauty, it does seem to be there are certain features that tend to be, fairly crossed universally. I mean, people talk about with like women, like high bust, to hip ratio, things like that, with men tending to be, greater muscle mass indexed, things like that. But you're right. Yeah, if we look at, what the painters were painting, in the what was considered the ideal beauty, like a painting of Aphrodite from the Renaissance or from later, definitely that would considered idealized beauty, which is probably not something that we consider now to be an idealized beauty.
What are the most beautiful concepts in philosophy for you?
The most beautiful concepts in philosophy.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily beautiful, but so the most important concepts which you encountered in your study and your pursuit of philosophical wisdom or knowledge.
That's kind of difficult to say. I mean, some concepts that maybe I didn't think about a lot. It's interesting because I think some of the Plato's ideas are so foundational, but and so they're definitely incredibly influential and definitely something to think about. But I'm not necessarily sure I completely agree with the views of the idealized forms or some what Plato was talking about. I think lately I've been kind of pondering some of the other, if we talk about like Heraclitus's idea of that change is constant. And I think that kind of ties in with some of the ideas coming from, the Eastern philosophy is, Buddhism definitely looks at change as being a constant thing and that things will always change. And the only true state of non-change is a state of non-existence, basically. And so I find those to be pretty intriguing. I find those in many ways to be kind of a little more relevant to kind of as we're learning more about the nature of the universe, the nature of ourselves, and as society evolves. I think those concepts are definitely
do you think that there's something
very important? I don't want to say beautiful. I'm not sure beauty applies to.
Yeah, but this like change is for me it's also kind of interesting concept, and like I always try to figure out this difference between being and becoming, and there are certain schools like in Heraclitus, for example, there's no being at all. There's nothing which is stable, and it's only a feature of our language or our mind which allows us to see like allows us to see things as as essentially as nouns, right? There's no nouns,
right?
Like it's right. When you just look at something and then you look at it in the next moment, you change, you are changed, and the thing also changed,
right?
And it seems there's like on one side there's nothing, but if you generalize kind of the highest level of abstraction, you may say, but like everything is just this thing is permanent, this thing like infinity in itself, it's kind of stable, it doesn't changes at all. And like I can't resolve this paradox. I can't agree with one or another side and say that there's permanent change or there's like no change at all. But what are your thoughts? How do you see it?
I find it's kind of interesting how, like you were talking about Heraclitus, how much Heraclitus's views kind of match the what would be called the Vedic tradition that comes out of India, that's where Buddhism comes from and Hinduism comes from. Is that, yes, this idea of impermanence, that nothing actually stays. And I think that's a direct contrast to the idea that the Platonic ideal that there are things that don't change.
Like perfect forms, right?
Right, they're perfect forms. And I think what we're finding out is that it's more that those ideas, these ideas of impermanence that are actually more descriptive of what, at least what we're understanding the universe to be like. And I think if you look at a lot of current physics, or even physics going back to relativity, is this idea that there really isn't fixed points, that there isn't that that really in some senses, what our existence is really is not something that's solid, or, well, I mean, solid in the sense that it actually exists, that
Yeah.
in fact we're more kind of, it's some of these, it's the current mind-bending physics about that.
Energy fields, right? So there's
Right.
no things, but it's all just energy. And
Right, but that, ultimately our existence and everything we perceive is essentially just fluctuations of vacuum. So those are oddly very similar to kind of certain things Buddhists thought.
I have one short quote. It's actually not short, but let me read it. It's about like being and becoming. So I guess it's from Wikipedia. It's it's about change. So being is an empty fiction. The state of becoming doesn't produce fixed entities, such as being, subject, object, substance, thing. These false concepts are the necessary mistakes which consciousness and language employ in order to interpret the chaos of the state of becoming. The mistake of Greek philosophers was to falsify the testimony of the senses and negate the evidence of the state of becoming by postulating being as the underlying reality of the world. They constructed a comfortable and reassuring afterworld where the horror of the process of becoming was forgotten, and the empty abstractions of reason appeared as eternal entities. Well, so like
Was
this.
that Heidegger?
No, I guess it's Nietzsche.
Nietzsche, okay. Yeah, I seem to recall hearing that before. I remember it was one of the German philosophers. But yeah, unfortunately, I've studied some of them. I'm not going to claim anywhere near expertise in the Germans philosophers.
Yeah, but this like, again, this idea that afterworld, for example, it's also kind of idealized state, right? It's not there, but you kind of escape in this world, being unable to face the reality of eternal becoming, eternal transformation. As human beings,
right? Yes.
Yeah, I think we tend to get to something stable, to like, okay, stable job, stable life, like marriage, whatever. But in reality, it's just it's always permanent. If you don't deceive yourself, that in like 10, 20, 30 years, it's not going to be the case. You can't hold to the same job forever. You can't hold to the same, girl forever. And then you create afterlife and say, yeah, then we're going to be forever together, or you are going to be in an ideal place or something like that.
Right. Yeah. I think I think if we talk about like the Greek philosophers, like the Platonic, like particularly Plato, but there's some preceding Plato, but I think it's a rationalist understanding of basically our existence and our place in the universe, and what are trying to understand, why do we exist? Why does the universe exist? And in many ways, these ideas of Plato were kind of some of the same ideas that, Descartes clearly was influenced by those ideas, but it's also, we perceive our existence. And from that point, if we take our existence as being our starting point, essentially at that point we have to claim that, okay, we exist, so therefore this is the fixed point. And at that point we have to build up this idea of what is the universe. And I can understand how they got to that point. It's again this idea that we don't actually exist is a very unsettling thing for the human mind. Our things will completely change, we will at some point not be here, is a very unsettling thing for the human mind.
What do you think about Cartesian dualism, like consciousness as something separated from physical world, like this?
You got a mind, spirit, physical duality, like a metaphysics.
Yeah.
I have kind of mixed feelings about it. It's difficult because I perceive my own existence. I can say that I'm here, I'm talking to you. That could just be a complete fiction of the senses, but at the same time, if I can close my eyes, put myself in a sensory deprivation chamber, I could probably still perceive that I exist. Whether that's and this the problem is we can't actually separate. We don't know how to completely separate ourselves from that.
Mhm.
And at that point, it's it is an act of faith then to just say that that we have an existence beyond that. And I myself am not, this is pure faith belief, am not a believer in like any Judeo-Christian idea of
Mhm.
life after death, but I do think there's a sense of consciousness possibly after death in terms of, but I tend to subscribe more again to these Vedic beliefs that there's might be a sense of consciousness that proceeds on, but consciousness in terms of if I'm conscious again in another form, I might not be completely aware of what my previous form was or not. It just happens to be that there is a certain, I don't want to say self, but there is a certain pattern that perhaps can go on. So
Uh,
again, I can't really explain it because I think ultimately that just ends up being a faith argument.
do you think that there's a fundamental contradiction between like this, let's say, feelings or emotions and your consciousness, your reason? Like, let me give you an example. I may want something, but I know that it's like at the same time I know that it's bad for me, and I try to avoid something that I want, but still it feels as if I really need this thing. And for me, it's kind of inner battle. So it goes on like I don't know, forever. Basically, I want one thing, I know that it's bad, I'm trying to avoid it, and I try to trust my consciousness and this knowledge more than my feelings. But some people, for example, they say no, you should follow your feelings and you shouldn't think too much.
Well, this is, yeah, and this is again, the Greeks have the same debate too. I mean, about this idea of the ascetics versus the hedonist. It's,
Mhm.
I think again, as we learn more about how the mind works and not just philosophy, but we look at psychology, our emotions aren't, this idea of the separation of emotions from pure rationality, I think is a false dichotomy. I think in many ways our emotions inform our rationality and actually help make up our rationality. There's a lot of talk about how do you judge things, and there's been, if I say if I want to eat a bowl of ramen versus a salad, how do I make that decision? Now we can say, okay, well, I need to eat, I need more fiber in my diet, or, so maybe I should eat the salad instead. But then I could say, okay, well, maybe, I'm feeling kind of cold, so maybe the ramen will be better. It's those you can kind of sit there and make rational, you can just kind of weigh, one versus the other. But ultimately there will be some sort of, often the deciding factor is just simply what at the moment do I want to taste? And this is where emotions does come into play. And a lot of these judgments, I mean, part of how our emotions kind of came about is our emotions aren't just kind of weird, just, glitches in the system. They're just things that are completely irrational, but certainly they were meant to, if we follow evolutionary biology, I mean, they're meant there to protect us. I mean, fear is clearly there to keep us safe. I mean, fear, love, lust is clearly there so we'll procreate. I mean, there are reasons. Now we can say you can take them to extremes, like if all I want to eat is donuts and drink beer all the time, that probably will not be good for me. That one being bad, even though I like donuts and I like beer. So that doesn't mean though the emotion, the desire to want to eat donuts and drink beer is irrational per se, because especially the storing up of fats and sugars in an area of scarcity would be a benefit. at the same time, you can argue that alcohol, originally fermentation processes, helped purify our water. So these things all came about originally. So I've come to this idea of saying, well, we're just going to deny, I'm going to overrule, my desires and my emotions. Is, yeah, you shouldn't just completely just give in to every single thought or emotion or desire you have. But at the same time, I don't think that's saying this is the triumph of rationality by completely overwhelming by being aesthetic or aesthetic, sorry, not aesthetic. But it's certainly in a lot of traditions. It's in the Western tradition. It's in the Vedic tradition. Being aesthetic was a very important thing in India. And it's still taught to this day. Yeah. But yeah, I just think it's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, but you say that like food, for example, for me it seems that it's necessary. So it's something that you without food you die. You can survive, but
right, yes.
Now there's so many things which you don't need, but people basically who know how to manipulate your emotions, they make you want these things, and then when you basically shut off your, like, let's say, rationality and follow your emotions, you basically are manipulated by people who make you buy stuff which you don't really need, but you buy them because somebody knows how to make you, buy this stuff. Yeah, I
Sure.
mean, like dresses, some expensive stuff, like all, like, all sorts of things. And when you are able to control it through your kind of rational mind, or by your consciousness, you basically say, okay, this, like, I want this thing, but is it necessary? It seems unnecessary. What's the purpose of, getting this thing?
Well, it's again, yes, it seems, is it necessary again for me to eat a bunch of donuts? It's probably not. No, it's in the long run, it will be bad.
Yeah,
for
but
me to
still,
eat a bunch of
food still is necessary, right? It's like you're
right.
here. You may basically moderate your desire, and if you are able to do that, that's okay. But there are certain things which you don't need at all. You don't need moderation. You basically you become addicted to those things since somebody else wants you to buy them. Like, so again, smoking. This
right. Yes.
This simple thing, like, do you need smoking in life? No, but people know how to manipulate. Like, especially when you're a child. For example, I started smoking when I was 8. And I started smoking because every adult around me was smoking. I thought, oh, if I smoke, I just look like an adult, and it make me feel cool, and it's nice. I didn't feel big difference between smoking and not smoking. I started figuring that out only when I was 20. I realized, well, it just ruined my health, and like, what am I doing? Like, what's the purpose? And when I started thinking deeply about it, when I realized why did I smoke, I quit almost like with no effort. And then I started thinking about other things like that. Basically, my emotions for the first part of my life, my feelings, I tried to trust my feelings, and it led to all sorts of troubles. But as I started using rationality and thinking, I wouldn't say it's complete contradiction, but for me, well, I try to rely more on kind of slow thinking. So I write things down, I analyze them, and if it works, yeah, great, I follow this. If it doesn't work, if I don't need it, I'm trying to avoid it. And it also seems to work like this.
Sure. Yeah. And I agree. And if you're talking about the idea that humans are manipulated by other humans, yes, we are. That's the nature. I mean, inherently humans we're social animals, and part of that means is that we come to terms to cooperate with each other, but it also means that we get manipulated. We get manipulated by people, whether for good or bad. I mean, as a tribal society, you'll have chiefs, you'll have your shamans, and you can say those people are manipulating the rest of the tribe for their benefit, or what they perceive as tribal benefit. In terms of, I don't want to get too far afield on that, but in terms of yes, we have a society where people are trying to sell you stuff all the time. That's part of, and I'm not going to say a capitalist society, because that'd be part of a socialist society. That'd be part of a communist society, is that I want something that I feel enhances my existence, or quote, to make my living. Therefore, I'm going to try to convince somebody else, well, either you're buying this product or service from me, or you're, doing I'm something for my benefit.
Mhm.
In terms of that, yes, I think though, to kind of what you're describing, yeah, I agree with you in that sense. We shouldn't just allow ourselves to completely be manipulated. We should understand our or why we're doing things. I think this is a matter of necessarily saying that, rationality should overcome emotion, but I think it's more a matter of self-awareness. I mean, if I'm aware that I have, certain emotions that will lead me to want something, then I can place that into certain context. Like if I want to eat a hamburger,
Mhm.
why do I want to eat a hamburger, if rather than just giving in to just a completely unthought out emotion of just saying, oh, I see a McDonald's, I'm going to go in and get a hamburger. It's more that, okay, well, maybe I just like a hamburger. Maybe there in sense, and there's nothing wrong with, with that emotional context, as long as you're aware that that is the emotional context.
Yeah, but what if you are aware, but at the same time, it's like your feelings are stronger than your, like you know that you shouldn't do that, but your feelings basically are stronger than your reason, and you go and do that anyway, and then you blame yourself, saying, well, like next time I won't do that, and next time after a week, 2 weeks, you do it again. Like, your emotions basically uh, rule over your thoughts, and you can do anything with your, with your rationality.
Well, this gets into the concept of guilt, and I'm not one of these people to say that you shouldn't have guilt about anything. No, you certainly should feel guilty at times. Guilt is, again, something that can be helpful, but I think it's I've seen this with people who are trying to overcome addictions
Mhm.
of various kinds, is that they end up, okay, they stop, they deny themselves whatever it is they feel they're addicted to, and they hit a breaking point and they just go, crazy, whether it's, they smoke a pack of cigarettes, drink a case of beer, eat a dozen donuts, whatever it could be. It's that, and then they feel guilty about it again, and you get caught in a cycle. I think,
Mhm.
like everything, I think that needs to be put into context. I mean, if I don't, I mean, I'll give you instance of kind of where I've basically engaged in denial. I mean, for martial arts, I've, wanted to get in shape and, training for tournament, but I've also had to cut weight, try to lose weight to get to my weight class.
Mhm.
And there, yeah, it's I've engaged in extreme acts of denial. Now, one could say that might even be necessary and healthy, because maybe that's just another form of addiction. But it's an understanding of context that, okay, well, I can't eat a bucket of fried chicken because I need to lose a kilo
Mhm.
of weight. But at the same time, I think in general, for my daily life, is kind of an understanding that, okay, well, I should not eat whatever I want, even though I could. And here in America, there's a lot of fattening foods all over the place. But at the same time, if I just say, well, I'm going to completely deny myself eating, you know, any of that,
Mhm.
because I feel like I'm, addicted to eating donuts or something, I think that gets to be a problematic, because then if I have a donut one day, then I'll just end up feeling guilty about it all day. I think it
Yeah.
just needs to be, there needs to be a context
Mhm.
understanding. And that's,
What kind of martial arts do you practice?
I practice judo, which is a Japanese martial arts, which is Olympic. I know a lot of Russians do judo. It's your president does judo. It's
Mhm.
it's a grappling art, so throwing and pinning on bars, now striking art. Yeah.
For how long?
I've been doing it now for more than 30 years. So
Oh wow, yeah, that's.
I'm no longer an active competitor. I mainly now just coach and referee.
Uh-huh. How does it make you feel? Like, does it gives you some calmness or, well, stillness of the mind when you practice martial arts?
Yes, it does to a certain extent, and I like everything else. I've tried to come to put in a context. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of talk about the kind of nobility of martial arts, and there certainly is that, and this idea that we do it because, it puts us, in touch with our bodies. It teaches us self-discipline, and there is definitely that, and keeps us in shape. I've come to think for myself, and many others who do it, is in some ways it is an addiction. It's an obsessive compulsive disorder. And I want to say, like, during the pandemic, when we couldn't train, it was very hard for the first few weeks. But there is what really kind of draws me to really doing it is there's a very immediacy about it. And one of the things that I think this is one thing that you hear a lot about warriors and the idea of conflict is that if you want to talk about perspective, the immediacy of life and death, and we have rules, so we're not engaged in a life and death struggle, but that immediacy, particularly with judo, where you're either getting thrown or you're throwing the other person, or they're trying to pin you. Yeah, it's a very immediate. It certainly focuses the mind. Let's put it simply. At that point, you're not, if you start worrying about something else beyond what you're doing at that moment, you end up losing. And that's one of the things that, if we like about it, there is certainly the sense of, when you do things well, there's a feeling of accomplishment, but there's just a basic kind of good sense of body awareness about doing stuff like that.
Is there some similarities between martial arts and philosophy in general?
Yes, there is, and there's a lot of philosophy in martial arts. Well, a lot of philosophers did martial arts, or more martial artists from philosophers.
Yeah, but by the way, Plato was famous. He was a champion.
He was a wrestler. Yeah.
Yeah, in Pancration.
Yeah, so many of the Greeks had served in military, and again, they idealized the human body, and they idealized sport. If you think about it in terms of as the exercise of the mind, in terms of philosophy, and versus the exercise of the body, and where you're stressing your mind. So many of these concepts that we deal with in philosophy are just, they're not things we deal with every day, and they're very difficult concepts to grasp. So in that sense, if we talk about the exercise of the mind versus the exercise of the body, because what we do in martial arts is not something we certainly do daily. I don't expect to try to throw somebody or pin somebody on a daily, just in my every average life. But at the same time, those things, that's an exercise of the body. But again, this is where we kind of break it down to a mind-body duality, and I think it's much more than that, because you don't lose your mind doing martial arts. It does absorb your mind, but you certainly require your mind to do it.
Do you think you may lose your body just practicing philosophy?
Yes. Yeah, well, you might. Yeah, you might. You get too wrapped up in it, and you forget to eat, and you just don't take care of yourself. Yeah, that's a possibility too.
Do you believe that it's possible that finally we'll get to the point where there will be kind of intelligence without a body? Just
do you think we could get to that point?
Yeah, we, like human civilization, create some kind of abstract artificial intelligence which do not require any body. Like, it will not have body, but it will be kind of, I don't know, in Descartes' sense, this mind, which
right, yeah, just unfettered. It's possible. I have my doubts whether humanity will survive long enough to get to that point. I think certainly if we talk about just our consciousness, again, just this idea that it's less of a thing, but it's more of a pattern. Yeah, I think certainly that's possible. We could duplicate that pattern. We could even take our minds at some point and encode them into some sort of knowledge, and just encode them in data. And at that point, the medium doesn't matter. It's like if I write a software program, it could run on multiple patterns, it could be sent, over the internet. It could be, at that point, it's just unfettered data. And it's possible we could say our minds could, at some point, we could figure out some way of getting our minds like that. I don't know. I don't know if humans will be able to survive to get to that point. I think there's a good chance that if we do actually create another artificial intelligence, which is looking more and more likely, is that might just be the end of us. That our intelligence might end up just supplanting us.
Yeah,
I
but
don't think
we basically become like not like bodies, but this next step in evolution of consciousness. Like it will be end of us, but what will come after us, we'll still consider it as kind of will be as we consider now some whatever chimpanzees or whoever we evolved from, right? So it may be okay. We're humans, but now we're these great minds floating around in clouds.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think again, if we talk about the mind and body duality, I think again our thoughts are still very rooted in
emotion and
our
biology.
bodies. We still we like we were talking about earlier. I don't think we can actually escape our bodies, and I think how we think about things is still related to basically how we interact, how our senses work. Even the fact that we have hands and feet and eyes. I think it's going to be. I think if we could completely detach ourselves, if like we could take our mind somehow and again encode it into energy or some sort of data completely, I think it would, if we did it now, I think it would drive someone completely insane. I don't think they could handle that. I think that would be that's why I'm saying I think it would end up being the end of us now. End of us as humans per se. We might I think like you were saying, the next it could be some other existence, but I don't think it'd be a human existence. It would be something beyond what we could understand at the moment. So
yeah, and still it will have some form, right? So even if it's just mind, we can't even imagine what does it mean, the mind without any form.
Yeah, right? I don't think that's necessary to conceive. I think any human, if you could take your consciousness and just put yourself on the internet, I think that would drive you insane immediately. I just can't see how
yeah, that's crazy idea. Have you watched this Black Mirror when
right, yeah,
there was kind of this idea that there's consciousness which exists nowhere and has to perform certain functions? I guess it was the episode called White Christmas.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that, but I know it's a frequent science fiction thing to think about disembodied consciousness or humans evolving beyond their bodies.
Yeah. All right.
But
the next question I'd like to ask is, what is the best way to study philosophy for you, like in your opinion?
For me personally, at the time, just because my schedule's gotten pretty busy, I have less time to sit and read, and it's particularly to sit and read, philosophy treatise, all the way through to the end. So it's unfortunate, and I feel I'm kind of forced to look at things more, with more breadth, wider than narrower. But I certainly think there, if you really want to understand, again, stuff like Plato, and you need to read the whole dialogues. You can't, just kind of skim through it. But it's difficult just because, for myself, speaking of such, I think it really depends. I think, and partly again depends what people are interested in studying. Some of this guys like Hegel and Heidegger, I don't think you can just skim them. There's just, it doesn't make, even reading them doesn't always seem to make sense. They're too depth of that. I think things like this help a lot. I think for people interested in philosophy, I certainly think just having discussions with other people who are reading, where you can bring some of your knowledge, listen to what other people say. I think that's a pretty good way of doing it. I think even if you read it in depth, it still helps to be able to discuss with other people to see. So I think philosophies shouldn't be an individual pursuit, and that I'm just going to go and sit down with my book of Plato's dialogues or whatever, or Heidegger being in time, just by myself and just read it.
So reading is kind of the best. I was thinking
reading is necessary. I think reading, it has to be reading and discussing. I think it has to be both.
I was thinking before we started, there was an interesting idea that in philosophy, I try to categorize all philosophy as an evolution of two forms, like two forms of communication. First is speech, and it's basically Socrates, who didn't write anything, who was just
Yeah,
teaching by.
Socrates just trusted writing.
Yeah,
Did
and,
not like it.
and another is writing. And I basically involve, like, I like to listen to some professors, to watch some lectures, and I also like to read a lot. And whenever I read, it seems that people who write books, they basically like do not appreciate those who can speak well. And most, like, often you find how they say, like, all these people who speak, they are basically like they do not do any philosophy. It's just some sophists, or they convince you, they use some elegant words, but essentially they like it's empty. It doesn't make any sense. Any philosophy must be written. And those who speak, they say, no, like all this written garbage, it's just some learning and scholastic and
Mm-hmm.
stuff which all these tractatus, whatever. It's not it doesn't come from the heart. It comes from something else, and it's not what you want to do if you want to like grasp the deep nature of reality, the highest wisdom. You have to contemplate and listen great masters and talk to them. And yeah, it's kind of this struggle, this even fight between these two modes of doing philosophy.
Mm-hmm. True. Yeah. So I can agree with you there, but I think you definitely need both. I'll add one more thing. You need skepticism also. I mean, it's important to be skeptical about things. I mean, to an extent, you get. I'm not going to say people who get skeptical about everything and say, oh, I just don't believe this. I just don't believe this. I mean, you have to look at it. There's critical. If getting back to one of the earlier questions you asked me, I think. And I'm not sure it's necessarily a philosophical concept, but it is important in philosophy, is critical thinking. And I think that it's definitely something that's very needed, not just in philosophy, but really in everything we do, is critical thinking and the ability to assess any new idea critically.
Yeah, we were doing some work with Sextus Empiricus with Bruno, like in the beginning of summer, in the end of spring. Basically, we'll try to read his Outlines of Pyrrhonism, the school of skeptics, the ancient school. And I read it back in 2015. And for me, it was kind of a revelation, since I read lots of idealists and materialists before, and I couldn't when I read, for example, Hegel, I think Hegel is the best. I just wrap my head around Hegel and I believe almost everything he says. And then I read Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer criticizes Hegel and says Hegel just empty head, whatever. An old woman doesn't know anything. And then that's true. And now I see what Schopenhauer, like how he explains Hegel. It's relevant for me. It's definitely something that I can understand, something that I can agree with. But then there's another guy like Nietzsche, for example. I read Nietzsche, and there's like Schopenhauer. It's an old woman, and you don't need to read Schopenhauer. It's all idealism. It's all nonsense, hogwash, whatever. And then, like, kind of, for me, it was very, like, on the one side, it was excited, but on the other side, I could just, I don't know what's going on. I try to think for my own. I try to write every day at least one page to understand what I'm doing, why I'm doing that. But eventually, like, I also want to understand how other people think. And then again, when I discovered skepticism, this guy Sextus Empiricus, he had a couple of books written back in, I guess it was the first or the second age, AD, and he basically says there's three categories of philosophy. So the first is dogmatists, and all dogmatists like Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, Stoics, they all are dogmatists, since they claim that they have found the truth and they know what is the truth, and they teach their truth. And there another school is it was called at that time academics, and it's a modern version of agnosticism. So
Mhm.
those people say that there's no way to find the truth. So truth is unattainable. You don't need to waste your time. Go and do something else. Don't study philosophy at all. It's just it's just nonsense.
Mhm.
And the last school was skepticism, which is we don't know what is true, but we try to, we still are looking for it. We still try to find. And
Mhm.
the main principle was the suspension of judgment. So you don't
Mhm.
judge. You don't, like, if Plato says this, you basically try to find the counter argument. And as
Right.
soon as you found counter argument, you don't say that the counter argument is true. You say, like, this is one argument, this is the counter argument. Neither of them is true, and let's look for something else. And you just try to, like, proceed forward and look to find truth, which is again, you can find it, since the truth for skepticism is unattainable. Whatever you say is the truth, but it's not unattainable. It's like you whatever you discover, there's no final truth, but it still doesn't mean that you have to stop searching.
Mhm.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree with you that critical thinking and skepticism, for me, it basically was, wow, that's pretty awesome. Now I don't need to, to trust everything that some authority, some person, some philosopher said. I just basically try to look at it through my own perspective and see what's true for me. It may work, and it's also, I guess, one of the most important elements in critical thinking is
Right. Yes.
self-criticism.
Yeah, definitely, exactly.
Since
Yeah, because you cannot just say your own personal experience is the end all. I mean, you have to, because
Mhm.
certainly all of us have different personal experiences. That doesn't mean you can apply. You completely say, well, I don't see this. So that's not what my life is like. I mean, that's certainly important to you, but that doesn't mean that's the same for everything. So it's self criticism is definitely a very important thing to have.
uh,
But
uh, are there some ways to practice critical thinking, like in martial arts, for example? You just have some actions, some movements, and you do them and you get better at it. But in critical thinking, what would you recommend to do to get better at it?
well, this is one of maybe the appeals things of martial arts is, yeah, if you do something wrong, you'll end up losing. You'll find out quickly that doesn't work.
Mhm.
I mean, that's kind of one of the things that's good, because there's an ultimate test to what we do, and that is, that doesn't mean people still have all sorts of debates all the time and arguments about, well, is it better to do something this way or that way? But that so you could say, well, fine, let's go and fight and see what happens. Um,
Mhm.
it's harder again in the realm of ideas, because we're not fighting per se. It's hard to find that absolute proof to say that. I think debate is very important. And I think, again, it's difficult because debate, have gotten less, and people have a harder time dealing with, when your ideas are challenged, and it's getting a little messier now. That's one reason why we have so much division, and not just, in America there's a lot of division, but I think the world there's a lot of division. But
Mhm.
it is important. I think it's important to talk to people who don't agree with you, to kind of find out, what is, to listen to maybe what they're saying. And that's a hard thing to do. But I think, and sometimes you have to debate yourself too. You have to ask yourself why, like you were saying, self-criticism, why do I hold this belief?
Mhm.
Why does this seem to make sense than something else? And yeah, I think, again, ultimately it's why I'm saying it's hard just to read things. If all we do is read things, yeah, that's great. And again, philosophers are, they're the ones we still read, are because they were very influential and because they were good at convincing other. If you talk about your people manipulating, yeah, you can argue, all these philosophers down history, we
Yeah,
still read them because they
yeah.
were able to manipulate most people
Mhm.
to buy what they're reading. I mean, we wouldn't care about, I'm sure there was, we went to the Agora in Athens, and 500, years ago, I'm sure there are plenty of philosophers there, yet we don't bother reading, and we're reading Plato.
Yeah.
So that's where you can get caught up in saying, okay, well, this sounds great, I'm just going to follow this. But I think it's important to talk to other people and say, well, what did you think about this? What did you, or, read other people. Like you said, there's other people who disagree. There are plenty of people at Plato's time who disagreed with Plato. I mean, Socrates was executed for a good reason. I don't want to say good reason, but there were reasons why. They didn't suddenly just randomly, sentence Socrates to death.
Yeah, corrupting the youth.
Right. Yes,
That
he was
was
corrupting the youth.
the main argument.
Right.
Yeah, now he's the greatest, like one of the greatest philosophers in the history, right? So his contemporaries consider him one way, but we look at him in the other. I guess it's important what you said about this selling ideas. So when basically as an idea, like, well, I don't think that Plato, we may say, just simply an idealist, but as an idealist, you may create some kind of ideal world, metaphysical world, and then you go and sell your books to other people and say, this is like, this is the reality, this is what's going on. And you may basically create whatever, like, you may create something out of just words, some pure concepts, and then you manipulate other people simply by making them believe that this is true and this is how it's kind of gaining some intellectual superiority, and then making your way through life by doing
Sure.
that. But,
yeah.
But now, yeah, there's so many, as you say, debates. Like you said, debates are getting less and less. Like, there's no real debates. Is
And
that
there still are real debates. I think people still have real debates, but I think debates in terms of where people feel like
constructive debates, like so?
Yeah, I think debates where you're willing to challenge your positions or willing to have your, I think it's getting, in some sense, getting hard, and maybe that's unfair read because I think one of the problems I've often talked about, I think, with the internet and this idea that is that in the 1960s, when the first kind of concepts of the internet were coming out, that at one point we would have this ability, like I'm here in Minnesota talking to you, outside Moscow, is that would essentially, unite humanity. We would all, once we're exposed to different ideas, we would all agree, or we would all start being able to see things from different perspectives and understand. That's actually become less true. I think what's happened is people have basically gone and you reinforce your own beliefs. And that's a problem, because if I can find someone that shares, let's say, like particularly like political beliefs, or you have a certain political belief, and I can find somebody in the UK that shares that same political belief. It's not like I'm really understanding more about the UK or understanding, it's more that I'm just reinforcing my own beliefs. So I'm just saying, well, hey, this guy agrees with me, so therefore I'm more right. And I think that's the problem, is mistaking just telling people, well, my view is right, your view is wrong. That's not debate. I mean,
usually,
debate is more, I present to you why I believe my view is right, you present to me why, and we can look at and discuss, the relative strengths of those arguments. That's debate, and I think that's a harder thing to have, but I think that's critical to to understanding now.
What you said about just finding one person like on the other side of the world, and basically confirming your view by looking at the same view. But now there are groups on the internet who basically, it's not just one person, but there are like thousands and millions of people who share the same views, and they, like, you may feel very confident by joining these groups and being in these groups and never looking outside, right? So any like radical views, there's always a group on the internet where you may go and communicate with people, and basically you feel as if you are right. And the point is, the more radical it is, the more the more strong sense of rightness and correctness you have by being a member of this group.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's clearly a problem. And I think a lot of this, why we see radicalization on all sorts of things, is partly driven by that. Yes, that you
But
once you put yourself, yeah, into one particular viewpoint, then you start, it's easy to get to the extremes of that viewpoint.
yeah, fortunately, we have still books, and if you just write a book and you publish it, or you share it with others, you may find people who may help you to realize your mistakes, where you're wrong, where you're right, and then we may have the same debates in literature, right? So on YouTube, yeah, it's very hard to find. It's maybe not hard, but it's more of when people uh, tend to get in groups, and when we have literature, it's more like you kind of you present your individual point of view, and there's somebody else who may disagree. It doesn't feel as if it's more it's more critical in a sense, which we meant like self criticism, and other people criticize you. Whereas if you communicate on the internet, it's very hard to be critical, since there's some elements of politeness, and it's in the communication, it's very hard to really disagree with somebody, since there's some kind of cultural norms and standards. But anyway, so does philosophy make us better? Like, what's your opinion on that?
If you hear that, that's my cat is paying attention here. Does philosophy make us better?
Yeah.
I do. Yes, I do actually believe that. And is that philosophy is, and I think philosophy is I think philosophy is something that everyone should study. I think in that sense it does. I think, like all these discussions we're having about learning to think critically, about understanding the human condition, I think that's something we need more of. And yes, I would have to agree. Now, again, the quality of what you're learning and again does matter, but I think everyone should be reading, at least some philosophy.
What exactly? Like, can you recommend some books?
Again, I think it's I think it's very important, particularly for those of us, in the West, but even in the Eastern, is as much problems as there are with the dialogues of Plato and things like that. I definitely think everyone should read them, because the foundation to understand Western thought comes from that. And I definitely think we should be learning that. At the same time, I think, again, the understanding of Eastern thought, but some of the things we should be reading, some of the Vedas, we should be reading like the Dhammapada, the teaching of Buddha, some of those concepts. I mean, those are important. I think, Machiavelli, definitely, I think, to understand kind of how our political system works. And like you were saying about how people are manipulated, certainly Machiavelli should definitely be understood. Some of the constructions like morality, things like that, St. Augustine. Yeah, it's hard to kind of narrow down a list. I would say Confucius is definitely someone who's important to be read. And so I would be kind of hard pressed if I had to make a curriculum of like a course born philosophies to kind of say that. But I think those people are certainly, obviously Aristotle, can't forget Aristotle. But there are certain things, and I'm going to say this from the American context, but I think definitely would apply in a world context too, is reading the Enlightenment, reading Locke. Very important to understand. For Americans, I think it's critical because our government is very much based off of Locke. But if you look at parliamentary systems too, you can say that Locke is very important. Locke, Hobbes, obviously, if we're going to start with looking at that. But then philosophers, these political philosophers like Montesquieu, who are helped to Rousseau, who kind of, the political world we live in are kind of created by there. So yeah, like I said,
Yeah, that's
it's
a
hard to
that's a lot
kind
of
of narrow these
yeah,
down.
that's a
There's
lot of
just
material, I guess.
yeah.
Plato, Aristotle, Confucius, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu,
Yeah, and Descartes, don't
the
want to
the
forget
the,
him.
the
There's
Cartesian.
just there's so many names out there.
Yeah, I would add Germans, like some
Germans, yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Kant,
Kant.
yeah, probably Kant, Marx, Hegel,
Mhm.
Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. Okay, is there something that you shouldn't read in
That you
philosophy?
shouldn't read.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was gonna make a crack at Jordan Peterson, but I've read a little bit of it. I don't want to say his stuff's completely bad. I think it's kind of it's Jordan Peterson's. He's gotten more wrapped up kind of a cultural war than he is.
Do not read Jordan Peterson. That's what you're saying.
I'm
Oh,
not gonna recommend not reading Jordan
yeah.
Peterson.
I actually read his 12 Rules for Life, like his,
Mhm.
and I also before reading his 12 Rules for Life, I was listening to his lectures so much. I mean,
Yeah, I've listened to one of his lectures. Again,
uh,
I think Jordan Peterson. Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of people who love him and consequently
mhm.
people who hate him. I don't necessarily think he's not. He does have some interesting stuff to say. I think it's just gotten caught up in this kind of culture war situation with Jordan Peterson, which is a bit of a problem. I
No,
mean,
I,
it's like like Ayn Rand
mhm.
is someone who I've
Well,
read,
it's
and I
not.
bring her up. The rest of the philosophy group doesn't like it when I bring up Ayn Rand, but there's a lot of good stuff in Ayn Rand. I mean, there certainly is. There's a lot of bad stuff in Ayn Rand too.
Have you like read Atlas Shrugged, right?
Yes, I've
This
read
book,
Atlas
yeah,
Shrugged.
yeah.
Ayn Rand is very popular in architecture circles because of the Fountainhead, but also
Is it
so because of the Fountainhead, a lot of people read Atlas Shrugged, and
is it
those
kind
are
of objectivism, like her philosophy, egoistic objectivism,
Mhm.
or I've read for new intellectuals. It was a short book, and yeah, I wouldn't say I remember much. I remember that she was kind of like Nietzschean type of thinker.
Yeah, it's very. She's certainly influenced by Nietzsche, but this is again her context matters, and Ayn Rand's context is important about when she was writing it and what her background was. Um, her views are, and I've known people, but good friends who are quote objectivist who are part of, literally the objectivist society. Is that it's some sense it gets almost cult like, but
Mhm.
you if you put it into context and say she was Atlas Shrugged is a polemic against communism, and in that sense, because she came from her
Mm.
family was fled Russia, fled where you are now, that kind of makes sense that she was writing a polemic, and her views got kind of more and more extreme. I think her embrace of capitalism is it's one again it's too caught up in politics, and I think too many people dismiss her just based from the political angle. Just the same, I think some people dismiss Jordan Peterson as,
Yeah,
or too many people
exactly.
fall in love with them because of the politics.
By the way,
Whereas I think there is some stuff there, and I will say this from the architecture side and the art side, objectivism is very appealing in
mhm.
terms of the idea that we're creating that society and everything is the creation of the mind and ultimately the individual mind that does. And it's an incredibly romantic notion that I think does have value to it. It's just, I don't think we should, start saying this is all about the individual. It's all about, the individual creation of the mind, and anything else is a crime, to quote, put it in Ayn Rand's terms.
What kind of emotions does evoke her reading? Like when you read
No, when
her
I've read
books?
Ayn Rand, I mean, she's got some great
Yeah,
moments.
but
There's my,
for me it's kind of emotional. So when I remember when I was reading, and not just Ayn Rand, but also Nietzsche and such
Mhm.
writers who, yeah, they have some message, but mostly like it influenced not your mind. Like you read Plato, and mostly it's boring. It's kind of it's not so exciting. But
Mhm.
finally, you have some. No, it mostly influences your rationality, your mind. But whereas when you read some great writers like Nietzsche or probably Ayn Rand, there is more kind of emotional involvement. So you
Right.
look and you start feel, oh, this is what must be. This is like how how you know.
Right. And I think, again, if you read like Hegel or, or Wittgenstein, it's very hard because there's not a narrative. It's not, this
Oh,
isn't literature.
there's some.
There's some, but it's not, they're not writing literature. They're writing a philosophical treatise.
Yeah,
Ayn Rand and Nietzsche both kind of,
it's
need just more of a straightforward philosophy, but they're wrapping up a philosophical treatise within, literature. Within Ayn Rand specifically is within a story. Be like every 10 pages, she ends up writing 10 pages of a philosophical treatise where one character just sits there speaking for, it ends up being like a dialogue of Plato basically at that point. But yeah, I think the entry to Ayn Rand and Nietzsche, I think, is a little easier than the entry to some of these other philosophers. But that's the problem, is that doesn't necessarily mean they're right. It just means it's easier to read.
Yeah. Oh, it's I would necessarily say it's easier, but it's kind of it's more exciting, and it affects mostly your emotions than
Oh,
your
sure, yeah, Atlas
mind.
Shrugged has, it's got a story, it's got sex, it's got violence, it's
Yeah,
got
you can you
big explosions.
even if you read just philosophical works like in Nietzsche, there's I don't mention Zarathustra, but other works, you basically identify with the writer. So
Right.
and
Yes.
you kind of you feel certain emotions. You like you try to put yourself in a situation when you are like writing these books and how you feel and what's going on, and it makes it affects you strongly. Whereas after you read, like, maybe it's just my experience, but after I read something like that, I like it feels great, but you stop reading about it and you usually stop thinking about it. Whereas when you're reading some philosophical works written as like for different purposes, you read, you don't think too much about it. It's boring, but then you stop reading and then you start thinking, and you may think for half a year, for a year, trying to figure out some concepts. But I want to return to Jordan Peterson to say a few more words. I discovered him before he became popular. I actually started studying English. It was 2016, and I guess in December of 2016, I first discovered his lecture, and I watched it, and I didn't understand anything. Like that time, I didn't speak English. In 2017, before he was in Canadian Senate, there was this around pronounce this issue. After which his channel it had only I guess 100,000 subscribers at that time, and I watched lectures like Personality and its Transformation, and in other lectures Maps of Meaning, and I enjoyed it too much, even without understanding what I was listening to. So mostly I could understand only like 20-30%. But then after half a year, he became very popular. Like he gained 2 million subscribers, 1.5 million subscribers in half a year. And I rewatched the same lectures, and at that time I already could understand everything what he was talking about. But I've noticed that for me, like I still watched like 5 or 6 courses of lectures, basically the same lectures, like Personality and Transformation of 2017, 16, 15, 14. And before all this started, all this political stuff and postmodernism and in his attacks on postmodernism and this political stuff, when he talked about psychology, he was like a totally different person.
Yeah, he's a psychologist by training.
Yeah, he explained. He's a great lecturer. He takes Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Piaget, and just explains what was going on in the last basically 150 years. And he does a very good job, and he doesn't, attack so much and this postmodernism. He doesn't try. He attacks communism. He attacks like these political systems, certain belief systems, ideologies. But it's not what was going on after, like in 2017, at the end of 2017 and 2018, and particularly what's going on now. And he basically became politically involved so much, and I guess,
Right, but this gets back to, if we're talking about people manipulating people, and again, I will say, yes, he's manipulating people. I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, but just his route to popularity and major success has to be his attack on these ideas of postmodern, particularly regarding gender roles and things like that. I think he's realized he has a very widespread appeal based upon that. His attack on, some of these things like critical race theory and regarding the leftist academia. Yeah, and it's in some ways, like you said, I think I've read some of Maps to Meanings, is that his kind of very few people I think who follow Jordan Peterson really are into, his issues about maps and meanings and these kind of how the construct of knowledge is based. I don't think they're that interested. They want to hear him basically attack
exactly.
talk about that there
Yeah.
are traditional gender roles and they're good reason for traditional gender roles.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit unfortunate. I don't think if you ask Jordan Peterson what he would think, I think he thinks he's probably doing very well. So, and he is. Yeah.
Well, returning back to this analogy between writing and speaking, well, I would say that he's a very brilliant speaker, but as a writer, I didn't enjoy reading him much. Like these 12 rules from life was, I wouldn't consider it as a book which I would recommend to read to anybody.
It's a self-help book is what it is.
Yes, that's exactly what it is, like self-help, and it's not even great self-help. It's just our self-help book. But anyway, a few more questions.
Sure. Yeah.
One is about some school of thought. Like, is there any particular school of thought which you think is better than others?
Yeah, that's difficult. I'm trying to think what I would personally subscribe to. It's hard to, in terms of, I'm not sure I necessarily say like I'm a stoic or I'm an objectivist or I'm I think part of this about trying to look at things critically, I guess you could say maybe I'm a modern skeptic in some ways, is that I have some suspicion of certain dogmas that if you're to come and claim that, well, this is the answer, that this is right, I'm somewhat skeptical of that. So in terms of school of thought, I don't know. I would have a hard time defining or saying what if there's one school of thought that's better than the other. I'll put this because this has been applied to me in academic circles, but especially when I was a grad student, even when I was teaching briefly in academia, I've been called a postmodernist, and there might be some truth to that because I grew up. That's kind of the time is postmodernism. I guess at the same time, I've got a huge history. I've got a really big interest in history. I'm very much a history nerd in terms of that. So I often look at things in terms of historical perspective and things like that. So which might not make me a postmodernist at that point, but in terms of the view of postmodernism of ahistory, or saying that, I might apply to that. I don't want to necessarily claim to be postmodernism or claim that postmodernism is the way to go. But it's something that's been applied to me.
Postmodernism, it's very hard to define, like what exactly.
Well, by nature, yes, it is. That's the problem.
I guess this Sex Empiricus, whom I mentioned, I would consider his philosophy as some sort of postmodernism in terms of like this deconstructivism, and there's no objective truth, and everything is relevant. But in terms of you can't define, like all we have is language. All we know, like all our knowledge is basically encoded in language, and depending on how we use the language, we basically may argue endlessly about everything.
Well, you're right. That's a big trend. Derrida is like that. It's hard to say, because if we get back to what we originally talked about this idea that, there's constant change, nothing is permanent.
Mhm.
People would say that's a postmodern belief, yet that again goes to pre-Socratics, to Heraclitus and the West, and goes back to the Vedics, which were, thousands of years old. So it's not exact postmodern belief, but it seems to be applied a lot to postmodernism.
It's kind of latest version of skepticism.
Right. Yes.
Postmodern.
I think
Mhm.
you're right
Okay.
looking at it.
Well, I guess I already I asked the question about books, but here's the question about philosophers, like some favorite philosophers. Do you have some favorite
Favorite
philosophers?
philosopher.
Yeah.
My fanboy. Again, yeah, I would go back to what I was saying earlier. There's some, I think, to understand kind of where human thought is, there are some very important philosophers, and again, agree, disagree with them or not. I still think you should, or people in general should read them. I think, again, I definitely think people should read Plato. I think that's there's a lot to say that disagrees, that doesn't make sense about Plato. That's, very simplistic. Some of the dialogues are just very forced.
Mhm.
But if we're going to understand really anything else, I mean, if you're going to claim to be a postmodernism, you should understand, these historical thought. You should understand, to adequately criticize something, you need to understand what you're criticizing. And
Do
so,
you think
yeah,
do you think it's possible to study philosophy just simply by listening to other people and having conversations and not reading anything? Like, there are some videos, for example, on YouTube. You may
Mhm.
just type, okay, Plato's dialogue, whatever, Republic, and then there's an explanation. It's short, 20, 30 minutes, and it tells you everything about Republic. And then you may basically watch like 50 videos about all Plato's dialogues. And then you may say, oh, like I don't need to read the original works. I may just watch these dialogues. And then you go find people who know Plato, who understand his ideas. And you basically discuss these ideas until you feel confident and until you think that you already know everything.
Yes, you can study philosophy, and in fact, you could argue that's how Plato studied philosophy.
Mhm.
Is they weren't reading; they were having, just discussions. I think, again, we have so much information out there, but the information versus knowledge is not the same thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, you can watch tons of YouTube videos, and I've watched how-to YouTube videos, how to do something. It's not, the problem is you're not necessarily getting in depth.
Yeah,
This is the problem of breadth versus depth. I think to have, I think to develop an introduction, yeah, that certainly helps. But I think ultimately, if we're really going to get serious, you need to read it, and a lot of this stuff isn't easy to read. That's the nature of it. But I think you can certainly get to, we have so much stuff pressing on our time about what we're spending our time doing. But I think if you really want to learn something, you definitely need to read the source material about
Mhm.
it. And I think if you want to be informed, but to have any sort of real in-depth, yeah, you're going to need to do it. Yeah.
Okay. My last question: what is wisdom?
What is wisdom?
Yeah,
That's one of the fundamental, like you might ask, what is being?
When I started this podcast, I was thinking basically, like one of the idea was to find the wisest person on earth, like among people living right now. It's like like,
Diogenes, and that's a lot of, yeah.
yeah, it's like Socrates. He went.
Socrates, was
he
saying
he
that,
went.
and then
He went to the oracle and it said like, Socrates, you're the wisest guy, and he
right.
started questioning everybody, and everybody told him something that something
Yeah, so
that they thought was wise, but Socrates, he knew that it wasn't wise, and he knew that he himself wasn't wise, and then he finally realized that being wise means that you don't know that you know that you don't know, right? This famous,
right. Yes. Yeah.
famous stuff.
That's Socrates. Interesting how he ended up being. Being the wisest person.
Yeah, but
he was
still,
the hero of his own story.
He basically had conversations with all wise men of his time, and like that's what I'm trying to what I'm trying to do, like to have conversations and to find the wisest man on earth and ask him what's going on and what is philosophy and what is going to happen in the future or whatever.
Yeah, wisdom is, I think the simplest explanation is knowing how to make the right choices.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you could talk about Socrates with wisdom was knowing your ignorance in many ways. Yeah, if you don't know what your limits are, I mean, that certainly you could do things, you can make the wrong choices. Like if I think I can fight a bear, that would probably not be wise. Because if I think, well, I can beat up humans, so I can go beat up a bear, that would not be knowing my limit. And
So it's kind of,
I think, if we look at something that's said in Buddhism about about this idea of what is the Eightfold Path, and it comes down to to right speech, right action, right thought, and 8 things that are attributes of rightness. That's what they define. Now, what is right? Well, that's always a hard thing to say. And if you look at kind of Buddhism, actually gives it of basically saying, well, if you do things wrong, they'll end up bad for you. If you do things right, you'll end up good. So if I go and fight a bear, that will probably end up bad for me. So that would be wrong action.
Unless you run away from it. Then.
Right. Yeah. Unless I run away. So I don't fight it. So that would probably be the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that, if we're going to talk about wisdom, I would try to reduce it down to kind of that utilitarian, to say that, if we can perform things rightly, and we probably, in the moment of doing something, wisdom would have to mean that somehow we can know ahead of time that our actions will be right. Like if I don't drive, if I don't get drunk and get in my car, that's probably being wise. Now, there's a good chance if I get drunk, I might not have an accident, but
Mm-hmm.
we don't know that at the moment. And it's pretty much guaranteed I won't have a car accident if I'm not driving drunk. So it's things like that. And how do you know that? Well,
so basically making right choices, but to make right choices, you have to have experience and you have to have knowledge. And what is the right knowledge? It's an open question, and nobody probably can tell you, but your experience will basically.
Right. Yeah. But this gets down again to when we're talking about martial arts, is one of the things is that experience, they have all these sayings like experience is best teacher, things like that, is that the immediacy of martial arts will basically tell you that if I do this result should happen.
You either lose or you win, right?
Right. Yes. Either, I will lose or win. If I do something stupid, chances are I'll lose. Now, if somebody else does something stupid, yes, I can probably win. But either way, that's the wisdom of the mat, as they say, or wisdom of the battlefield. Now, how do you get there without risking your life, risking your safety, your health? Again, I don't know. Can you get it just from reading books? Maybe. If I read something in a book and it tells me, well, I should do this, and that works out, maybe. But is that true wisdom if I don't know? If I tell you not to do something, you don't do it, but you have no concept of why or how. This gets back to that question of meaning. Is that wisdom? And again, that's one of the big debates in philosophy.
Okay. Sishir, thank you so much for a conversation.
No problem. This was a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm glad I could do it.
Yeah. I guess we may stop here.
Okay.
Okay.